Um, the outline is very brief in some things, very in-depth in others, and I'm going to try to at least make you think, give you an idea. I actually thought about, and I even looked up and found some pictures and some different things, but then I would spend all my time going over the pictures and showing the pictures. I may do that later and just give it to you to look at on your own time. But as we thought about the flood of Noah, and we looked last week at part of it, we looked at what led up to the flood. We looked at very briefly what God did. But tonight I want to go into a little more detail on some of these things. And then next week, I'm already planning a week ahead, we will look at some of the consequences of the flood. Now, if I were to ask you, how many of you believe in the Ice Age? How many of you believe in the Ice Age? 1, 2, 3, 4, okay, several of you. When and where and how did the Ice Age come about? Evolutionists say it took place over millions and millions of years. How did all the ice get to the North Pole? You know, there are places where ice is miles thick. How did all the ice get there? Somebody had one huge fan blowing to freeze that much ice, you know, that thick, that far up. But in looking at the flood, tonight we're going to focus on some things that actually occurred during the flood itself. We know that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. What was it? A few weeks ago it rained for 3 days or 4 days, and we know all the damage that did. Imagine pouring down. I don't mean light sprinkles. I mean downpours for 40 days and 40 nights. In fact, it's been many years ago. I was pastoring here, but I was invited to speak at a Bible conference over in, I think it was Illinois or Missouri. Can't remember. I think it was Illinois, but it was way, way, way over in Illinois. So I preached and got up the next morning, and I'm heading home, and I hit the biggest downpour of rain that I have ever encountered. It wasn't rain, it was like buckets, you know, nonstop, just buckets, buckets, buckets of water. It got so bad, most of us were pulling over to the side. It only lasted a few hours, but it did all kinds of damage. Imagine that kind of rain for 40 days and 40 nights. Not only that, but it says the fountains of the great deep, which we know today the fountains of the great deep would be volcanoes probably. And there you picture volcanoes exploding all over the world. How many of you remember, you're too young, how many of you remember when Mount St. Helens erupted back in 1980? 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted. Were you even born then? Was your mama born then? She's not going to tell us. Okay. But anyway, I can remember it because it was all over the news. In fact, I found pictures of it. They actually recorded as it was spewing, you know, water and lava and everything out. I actually found, you know, some video of it. But in a matter of hours, it completely destroyed several cities, villages. I can remember watching it on TV. You know, as the lava flowed down, it took whole entire forest, trees, everything, just snapped the trees off, carried the trees downhill, and then buried them at the bottom. I mean, it did devastating, work. It wiped out houses. I mean, it just wiped out houses like it was nothing. That was one volcano for a few hours. Picture thousands of volcanoes all over the world, all spewing, gas, all spewing water, spewing lava, spewing all of this stuff up for 150 days. And we still can't imagine the devastation that took place. We know today from submarines and other means that there are inactive volcanoes all over the bottom of the ocean. Now, let me throw a trick question at you. From the bottom of the ocean, how much damage could they really do? That was a trick question. Do what, Charles? Tidal waves. But they weren't on the bottom of the ocean during Noah's flood because there were no oceans yet. The oceans didn't come about until the water began sinking. And by this time, and I will look at some of this, the earth had split open. The water rushed into the ocean, but at one time, and I mentioned this, I think, last week, at one time, there was only one great big huge continent. All of the continents today were one big huge continent covering much of the world. And as they split apart, the volcanoes were erupting, and then suddenly the earth is splitting open and, the earth is sinking. And so the volcanoes sunk to the bottom of what is now oceans, but they weren't oceans back then. They were all above ground and only sunk sometime later. I looked up, there were at least 10 other very famous volcanoes. Mount St. Helens being one of the biggest, but there were others that were almost as big, and we got pictures of it. Some of them we have videos, and just watching the sheer damage that was done as millions of tons of ash, hot melted lava come flowing down, knocking everything in its path down and burying it. So all of that was going on. And then there were the hurricanes. Probably not many hurricanes. There were probably much more tsunamis, as Charles said. How many of you remember the tsunami back a few years ago that just about wiped out an entire island over in the Philippines? The earth hundreds of miles away, out in the ocean, hundreds of miles, the earth mantle, hit each other or did something, caused the mantle to move. And when it did, it caused a tsunami that was hundreds of feet high, that traveled hundreds of miles, hit the island there in the Philippines, and just about wiped it out. That's one tsunami. That's one earthquake or earth mantle hitting. Throw in with that the continents being split. How much force do you think it would take to split an entire continent in half? We were talking before church, y'all weren't here. I took my grandson I started back to the gym this week after 3 months. And so I took my grandson with me. And as we were leaving, one of the older gentlemen had been watching him. He goes in and goes over to the right side, which is all weightlifting. I go over to the left side, which is, more body action, movement. So the older gentleman looked at him and said, how much were you, I don't know which one it was. There's some of them where you pull up like this. There's some where you bench press. They got all kinds of things. He said, how much were you lifting on that one particular, machine? And my grandson said, well, which machine are you talking about? And the guy told him, he said, how much were you lifting at that point? He said, well, on that particular machine, I was only pulling 600 pounds. That's a lot. Bench pressing, and I had to explain to my wife what bench pressing is. Bench pressing, he was doing 225, and I'm up to about 20 on one of my machines. But imagine, and what got me on that is the other day, as strong as I am, we had ran a book, and as it turns out, we used the wrong paper and it was going in the wrong direction. So I didn't want to get it mixed up with the correct book. So I took a handful, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 sheets of paper, and I thought I'll just tear them in half so we know they're not the right book. And I pulled and I pulled and I pulled and pulled, and I couldn't rip 20 pages in half, let alone rip an entire continent in half. So you got this tremendous force pulling these continents apart, splitting entire continents, and all of that is going to cause all kinds of water, flooding, and I put washing back and forth. My grammar program on my software kept telling me that was very improper English. But anyway, everybody knows what I mean. You've seen water as it swashes back and forth, and it goes and it twirls and it circles and all of this, and the damage that it can do. Imagine water, and we'll get into this much more detail next week, water traveling thousands of miles as fast as water can fly with all the earthquakes and everything that's taking place. How much damage do you think that would do? I think it would do a lot of damage. Miles and miles, and I don't know, I found some of them today, but I didn't print them because I don't plan to get into that aspect of it till next week. But think of mud, miles and miles thick, being carried by billions of tons of water from place to place. It's no surprise, and if I can find them, I've got pictures. I've just got to find them. Entire trees standing upright, buried in mud and fossilized. Evolution says fossils are formed by a little layer of paper, you know, and it lands, and then another layer of paper comes along, or mud, and it lands, and over millions of years, you've got layers and layers of mud that are now feet thick, miles thick, all from one layer of mud laying on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. We believe that all happened during the flood. The flood is carrying millions of tons of mud, moving it across continents, and it buries anything that gets in its way. Now, and again, what is it, one picture's worth 1,000 words. So I may get the pictures if I can find where I put them. But trees standing perfectly upright with leaves, in some cases, standing upright for millions of years, while one layer of mud after the other finally buried that tree, and it fossilized over millions of years. How many of you have cut down trees? I'm sure you've cut down some trees. You've cut down some trees. I know you have. What happens to a tree if you leave it lay there very long? I'm sorry? It rots. But according to evolution, it stood perfectly still for millions of years while it was slowly covered by layer and layer of mud. It would have rotted long before then. But we'll actually, the more I talk, the more I think I may have to dig out some of my pictures. We find places where whole forests are buried, fossilized in a very, very short time. Entire animals would be buried. I can remember over the years, and somebody actually gave me a number recently. Have you ever seen a bridge with flood waters going over the bridge? You know, the water's up to the bridge, crossing the bridge. And I knew you don't want to drive through water when it's crossing the bridge. But I read the other day that 6 inches, which is just ½ inch above this sheet of paper, 6 inches, is strong enough in a flood to pick up and carry an entire car, dump it off on the other side, carry it downriver, and 6 inches can pick up an entire car and sweep it off of the bridge. I think about the times I crossed water when it was up to my hubcaps, but I did a lot of stupid things. Don't ever do that. I did some really dumb things. But imagine the whole world, not 6 inches, but 22.5 feet above the highest mountain, and all of this water is swinging, swishing back and forth, and it's moving, killing, knocking down, destroying everything in its path. And this I'll have to find the picture because you won't believe it otherwise. They have found whole animals, completely intact, with skin, fur, everything, whole great big animals with grass still in their mouth eating, grass in their stomach undissolved, and those animals were buried and preserved. And when we dig them up, they look just like they were just alive. Got to be buried pretty fast to do that, don't you? You know, this week I guess I was going to Cincinnati for something. I was going somewhere, and there was a deer alongside I-75. I don't know how long that deer had been there, but it was not edible, and I'll leave it at that. That deer had been there long enough that it was decaying. It was disgusting. It had only been on the side of the road for, I don't know, a couple days maybe. To bury an entire animal, completely bury it and preserve it in mint condition, it had to be buried very, very quickly. How long does it take to make a fossil? We'll look at that next week. But you can make a fossil in under 1,000 years. I'll leave you in suspense. How many of you ever found, well, no, I don't want to get too far into next week. As these waters went, what would be buried first? My wife knows. Do I, David? Well, okay. I'm thinking more along the line of life. I didn't say that. What animals or life creatures would be buried first? That would be me. Well, if you ever look at evolution, they'll show that life started as little bitty, teeny animals, and then it turned into fish, and then as you go up, you find animals that are bigger, and they say this is proof of evolution. You know what got buried first? The ones that were closest to the ground. The fish in the seas. They were buried very quickly. Then the other animals that were able to scamper about and climb trees, you would find them higher in the level of fossils. Man, we find very few human fossils because man could climb the mountains, man could do all kinds of things, and man, even if he got to the top and he was eventually buried 22 and a half feet, what happens when a person drowns? A human person. Do what? Well, they're dead, but after they're dead, what happens to a human body after it dies? I'm sorry, I don't. Maybe. If they float long enough, the birds and scavengers could eat them. Wow, I thought this one would be easy. How many of you remember the police officer, Covington police officer, several years back? They were in pursuit from Kentucky. He was a Kentucky officer in pursuit. A car was crossing the Singing Bridge, I think. He was crossing the Singing Bridge. Cincinnati police cut him off. So the Covington officer jumped out of his cruiser, ran up toward his car. The Covington officer was in this side. The guy was on the sidewalk beside the road. Got the road, what we now know was about a 6-foot gap, and then the sidewalk. The guy was running up the sidewalk. The Covington officer thought, I'll run ahead of him with my cruiser. I'll get ahead, jump over to the sidewalk, and we'll catch him in the middle. Covington officer did not know there was about a 6-foot gap between the road and the sidewalk. He jumped over the edge of the road, went straight down. They started, I remember because I was still working then. I attended the viewing, and they started immediately searching for his body. Immediately. They couldn't find it anywhere. They searched and searched and searched, and his body was nowhere to be found. About a week or two later, somebody called, and there was a body many miles downriver. What was that body doing? Exactly. Over time, in water, we have enough gas in us that we will eventually, and that's how they found him. Several weeks later, they found him because somebody several miles downriver saw this body out there floating on the water, and they called and said, it looks like a police officer. And it was. It was him, left a wife, couple small kids. But he floated. If humans drowned in the flood, they would float, and you wouldn't find a whole lot of human fossils. They would have floated, they would have rotted, deteriorated. Buzzards, if there were any left, would have eaten them. So that's why we do not find a lot of human fossils, because we would have drowned, floated, and eventually the bloating would have gotten so bad that who knows what would have happened. But it would have laid down, and again, I found pictures, but I didn't want to use pictures. Now I'm second guessing myself. There are layers of rock. And when I say mud, I'm not talking about your mud like you find. This is the mud that will, when it dries, will harden and turn into rock. There are areas that one single layer, not start, stop, one continuous non-stop layer of rock over several continents and hundreds of miles. How did one layer of rock cover thousands of miles? According to evolution, it didn't. But I am going to have to find pictures just so that you can see that. I do have pictures of rocks. I mean, we're talking rocks 3 feet thick, 6 feet long, who are bent at a 90-degree angle. Have you ever tried to bend a rock? How easy is it to bend a rock? Especially one that's 3 feet thick and 6 feet long. How do you bend a rock that big? Well, I'll show you next week.